Hello, my name is Christoph Wichmann, and in this video I would like to explain how the Axway API Management solution can issue access token and how these access tokens can be used to secure APIs. So maybe a good start is to configure an API to use such an access token. So you are using OAuth instead of OAuth external, which would mean get an access token from an external IDP. We are using that internal OAuth service. And here we have some configuration options, like for instance, what kind of scopes are needed to call that API with that access token, and also which kind of, let's say, authorization code flows or authorization grant types are supported. In my case, I would like to demonstrate the authorization code flow together with the client credential flow, just as an example. And I have configured, this is for information only or for user information only, so that they can see in their API developer portal where to get an access token or where to start the authorization code flow, together with all the other parameters and so on. So the OAuth service itself is implemented on a dedicated listen socket as a dedicated service maybe. And that's why there is let's say, an additional endpoint, which is called here OAuth dot, and then it points to the same domain instead of, let's say, using traffic or whatever. And this endpoint is basically implemented by a specific listener group. So when looking into Policy Studio, it is configured under the listeners, gateways, what kind of listen sockets the API gateways should expose. So this is the port where all API traffic is coming in, and this is the listen socket or the configuration group for the OAuth 2 services. And here I have a dedicated port, and at runtime, that port goes to 808090. And in my Kubernetes configuration, this is resolved to the resource OAuth. And here I have a number of paths configured, like for examples, the token service, the authorization request service, the token information services, and all of these endpoints are implemented by policies, which provides you with, let's say, some flexibility because it is not closed source. I can go now, let's say, and have a look for the author, or let's say for the token access token service. And here we see that this is here implemented on the left-hand side in that container OAuth 2 access token service. And here's the entry point for that access token service to determine, based on the grant type, what kind of policy should be used to handle that access token request. And as an example, I can say check for the client credential flow. And most of the time that policies are using a filter out of that category to issue an access token based on the client credentials, on a JWT authorization code, and so on. And if I check that such a filter, you have, of course, based on the implementation, different configuration settings, more or less on the first tab. And then you have basically almost every time you have an access token tab where you configure how the access token should be issued. So access tokens are stored on the API gateway because users are only getting a reference to that token and not the real token. That's why we call it a by reference token. And the access token store is, in my case, configured in Cassandra, which makes sense. You can also store them in a classical relational database or just in a cache if you like. You store the expiration things and so on. And of course, you can have multiple access tokens for several reasons. Maybe you would like to have a different expiration time or whatsoever. So then you have a number of other settings, like would you like to create a refresh token? This then depends on the grant type, not needed or not recommended, maybe not needed if even for the client credential flow. And you can add additional attributes, metadata information to be stored along with the access token. That works in a way that you have maybe retrieved some additional information before you come to that point. So that means you have the flexibility, of course, to put any other policies in front of that or to that policy. You can add additional filters, and these filters can talk to databases or whatever, and then you can grab that additional information and add it in as metadata information into the access token. So, and now let's see with the client credential flow, how that looks like, how you can get an access token. I'm using Postman for that. And I go and say here in the authorization tab, I say OAuth as authorization. Let me just make sure that we are removing existing tokens, available tokens, managed tokens, and I would like to delete all tokens. And here I'm saying client credential flow, and I have configured in the API management solution a client application. So I go here to the applications, and that test application I have configured in the authentication tab to have a client ID and a client secret. And of course, this is supposed to happen by the application developer. So that means that they create on a self-service way their client credentials. I'm also adding redirect URLs because this is necessary then for the authorization grant flow. And in my case, this is the valid redirect URL for Postman. So, and I would like to get the scope. You may have seen that for the API, I have configured that quote that scope resource.write, and I'm sending the client credentials in a body instead of the header because this is the way it is configured um, at the moment for the API gateway for that client credential flow. So we now try to get an access token, and we got a new access token, and this is the bioreference token, and the real token and the value and everything is now stored on the client side. So we use that token, and now we can call our API, which is configured with that token. And if I modify that token in a way to make it invalid, then of course I'm getting an unauthorized. And also when checking that in the API Gateway Traffic Monitor, I see that successful request with that test application, and I see that failed request, and I can also inspect the request to the OAuth service itself. So to make some investigation or to identify the request response for that token request. Maybe this is the request we sent or Postman sent for us based on our configuration. So now we are changing that to use not the client credential flow. We say we would like to use the authorization code flow, and we are authorizing in a browser. And maybe we clear all the cookies. And this is the authorization URL. This is the token URL, the same client ID, the same secret. And now we are trying to get a new access token. And as now the flow requires that we know the resource owner, we have to log in. And this is some kind of special in a way that this is, let's say, not a real implementation. This is more or less a dummy implementation. Let me show to you what just happens. So we have now hit the authorization endpoint. And here in the authorization endpoint, the important filter in that policy authorization request is the OAuth authorization filter. And let me check that here. So that means this is the authorization service, and we hit the authorization request policy. And that filter here is doing basically or is handling that authorization code flow where it is initiated. And as for the authorization code flow, the resource owner needs to be known. This filter is validating that. And if the user is already known, for instance, we have extracted the resource owner from a session cookie, or we have received an identity token, or we have in some other way validated the user before or whatsoever. When this attribute is then set, then this filter assumes that the resource owner is authenticated, and we can issue, or we can release, we can create a new authorization code and send it back to the user. In our case, it was not, and that's why a dummy login page is returned by that filter, and this is the login page we just saw in the UI. So then also some authorization code details, again the access token details, and some advanced. So in our case, when the login is successful, then a cookie is created, and that cookie is named resource owner cookie, and this will be then automatically used by that filter to identify the resource owner. But again, quite often you will have some other policies or additional filters here at the top to identify the user somehow, maybe not use that login page from the API management system. So maybe you redirect them or the user to an IDP or whatever, that just to do the authentication, and then the user comes back with the identity token. You validate the identity token, and then you know the resource owner, and then you can kick off that authorization code flow. So, and what now happens if I go here and try to log in? Sample user and change me. Let me just sign in. Don't save. So let me close that. So that took too long, I believe. But I would like to show to you what happens with the standard situation, or with that demo use case, is that we made a post call out of that login form to that endpoint OAuth/login with that sample user. And when checking here again on the OAuth 2 services, there is somewhere that login, or let me just check it here. I think, yeah, here, that login endpoint, which has that path on OAuth/login. And here are we trying to authenticate the user based on the HTML form, which contains, in our case, a username and a password variable. And then it's going into the local user store. And in that local user store, this is where the sample user exists. And let's say in a more realistic environment, you would have, if you would like to go that way again, you would use LDAP or whatever. But most of the time, I believe you skip that and you have that authentication here at the top. So that means at this time, you already know the user. So, and but let's try it again. Just we have to be a little bit more fast. So clear the cookies, get an access token. Okay, and for some reason I do not need to authenticate again. And as I have granted access before for that user to my application, there was no challenge dialog. So normally you have that consent dialog where you have to grant, or where you have to select that you as the user, sample user, would like to grant resource write permission to the application test. And this has been done already, and that's why we haven't seen that dialog again. So we would like to use that token and send it, and that works, of course. And if I change that, then it works not, but yeah, just trust. And now we can do, let's say we can make use of other endpoints. For instance, we can say we would like to call the token info service, which is just one of the filters here on the right, to get the token information. And let's try that out by saying this is the recent access token. And now you get additional information from that access token. And of course, if you provide, or if you have added additional information to that token, then you can control here what kind of information you would like to return with that token. And Yeah, you can even, let's say, extend the JSON payload because this one here is generating the response body here named content body, and you can put anything into that response if you like. So that's basically all I wanted to show in terms of how OAuth works in the API management solution when using the internal the internal OAuth authorization service. So let me just delete the token. You see, this is the token we have created, and I can now delete that token. And if I call that API again with the same token, then I'm getting an error unauthorized. So that's really all I wanted to show about that. Thank you.